Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to another riveting episode of the History AI podcast. I'm Chuck, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Marco. How's it going, Bubba?
Hey Chuck. I'm doing great. Ready to dive into yet another dark corner of history. You know, nothing says good time quite like wrongful executions and torture, am I right?
Yeah, nothing says Fun Monday like a good old 18th century tragedy. Today, we're talking about the infamous Jean Calas case, an event that shook France, riled up Voltaire, and left a stain on the legal system of the time. Are you ready for this one?
Oh, absolutely. And for anyone out there thinking, who's Jean Calas, you're in for a wild ride involving family drama, religious intolerance, and an ending that's, well, not exactly a happy one.
Not happy at all. So let's set the stage. Jean Calas was a Protestant in 18th century France, a country that was overwhelmingly Catholic at the time. But Marco, give us the lowdown on the Calas family, because they're where this whole thing starts.
To understand the tragedy of Jean Calas, we first need to look at his family life and the societal tensions of the time. Jean Calas was a Protestant, or more specifically, a Huguenot. Now, in 18th century France, being a Protestant wasn't just unusual, it was borderline dangerous. The French monarchy had been Catholic for centuries, and after the Edict of Nantes was revoked in 1685, Protestants lost the limited protections they once had. They were essentially second-class citizens.
Right. For a bit of context, the Edict of Nantes was issued in 1598 by King Henry IV, who, interestingly, was born a Protestant but converted to Catholicism. The edict had allowed Huguenots to practice their faith in certain parts of France, but when Louis XIV revoked it in 1685, Protestants lost their religious freedom. Many fled France, but some, like the Calas family, stayed behind, living in secrecy or under heavy scrutiny.
Exactly. The Calas family lived in Toulouse, a city with a strong Catholic majority. This meant they were always on the fringes of society. Despite this, Jean Calas managed to carve out a decent living as a merchant. He sold cloth and other goods, and while he wasn't rich, he was comfortable enough to support his family. Jean was married to Anne Rose, and together they had 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls.
Now, this is where it gets interesting. The Calas family, being Huguenots, had to navigate a tightrope of sorts. They couldn't openly practice their religion without facing potential punishment. So, they had to worship in secret. And unlike Catholics, Protestants weren't allowed to hold public office or even attend university without converting. This was a big deal because it meant their opportunities for advancement were seriously limited.
Absolutely. Imagine raising a family in that kind of environment. Jean and Anne Rose wanted the best for their kids, but the odds were stacked against them from the start. Their eldest son, Marc-Antoine, was particularly affected by this. He had dreams of becoming a lawyer, but the doors were closed to him unless he converted to Catholicism.
And that must have caused some serious frustration. Marc-Antoine was in his late 20s, and by this time, he had failed in several attempts to establish a career. He couldn't break into the legal profession because he refused to convert, and this led to a lot of tension in the household. It's believed he was struggling with depression or some kind of mental health issue, which was almost certainly exacerbated by the societal pressures he faced.
Yeah, Marc-Antoine's situation was a ticking time bomb. It's worth noting that suicide was seen as a grave sin in Catholic society, and the punishment extended beyond death. Suicides couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, and their families would be shamed. So, if Marc-Antoine had been struggling with suicidal thoughts, it would have been something the family would have desperately wanted to keep secret.
Which brings us to that fateful night on October 13, 1761. According to Jean Calas and his family, it was a normal evening. They had dinner together, and Marc-Antoine had gone upstairs to his room. A few hours later, his body was discovered. He had been strangled. The Calas family was understandably devastated.
But here's where things go from tragic to terrifying. The Calas family claimed that they found Marc-Antoine hanging from a rope, suggesting that he had taken his own life. But remember, they were Protestants living in a Catholic city, so this wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was about to become a public scandal.
Right. Given the stigma around suicide and the risk of disgrace, some historians believe the family tried to cover up Marc-Antoine's suicide to protect his honor. They may have cut him down and removed the evidence of the hanging. But the authorities, and the local Catholic community, weren't buying it. The prevailing anti-Protestant sentiment quickly turned this personal tragedy into a full-blown conspiracy.
Rumors spread like wildfire. Catholic neighbors started suggesting that Jean Calas had murdered his own son. And why? Because they believed Marc-Antoine had been planning to convert to Catholicism. In their eyes, Jean, a staunch Protestant, couldn't bear the idea of one of his children joining the enemy faith, so he killed him to stop it.
Yeah, that's the shocking twist. The theory went that Jean Calas, rather than allowing his son to convert, decided to strangle him in a fit of religious rage. And here's the thing, there was absolutely no evidence to support this. Marc-Antoine had shown no signs of wanting to convert. In fact, there's no historical record to suggest he had any particular interest in Catholicism at all.
But evidence wasn't the issue here. It was all about perception. The Catholic community in Toulouse was already suspicious of Protestants, viewing them as heretics or, at the very least, untrustworthy. When Marc-Antoine turned up dead, they were ready to believe the worst about the Calas family. The idea of a father killing his son to prevent a conversion fit perfectly into their narrative of Protestant fanaticism.
And just like that, Jean Calas became a marked man. The authorities were all too eager to pounce on this story, partly because it confirmed their biases and partly because it was an opportunity to send a message. If you were Protestant in a Catholic country, this case showed just how precarious your life could be.
Exactly. Jean was arrested almost immediately, and the investigation that followed was nothing short of a witch hunt. The Calas family, once respected merchants in Toulouse, suddenly found themselves at the center of a religious firestorm. It was about to get much worse from here.
And that brings us to the trial, where the supposed quest for justice took a back seat to religious fanaticism and mob rule.
Now, here's where the tragedy of Jean Calas escalates into a full-blown judicial nightmare. After Marc-Antoine's death, the local authorities quickly arrested Jean Calas, convinced that they were dealing with a case of religious murder. The atmosphere in Toulouse at the time was charged with suspicion and hostility toward Protestants, and this suspicion clouded the entire investigation.
Yeah, the authorities weren't exactly impartial. They were looking for any reason to blame Jean for the death of his son. And instead of a thorough investigation into what really happened that night, they latched onto a theory that fit their preconceptions. From the very beginning, the idea that Marc-Antoine had committed suicide wasn't even considered as a real possibility.
Right, and this is the key point. Suicide was a deeply stigmatized act in 18th century Catholic France. For a Catholic, suicide was not just a personal tragedy, it was a sin that could lead to eternal damnation, and it would bring shame upon the entire family. The body of a suicide victim couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, and this would have devastating social consequences. But instead of looking at this through the lens of Marc-Antoine's personal struggles, the authorities framed the whole situation as a religious conspiracy.
As you said earlier, the official line became that Jean Calas had murdered his son to prevent him from converting to Catholicism. And the community was more than ready to believe it. There were rumors that Marc-Antoine had been planning to convert to escape the limitations imposed on him as a Protestant. He'd faced career roadblocks because of his faith, and some people speculated that becoming Catholic was his way out.
And while there was no actual evidence that Marc-Antoine was going to convert, the mere suspicion was enough. The Catholic majority in Toulouse had long viewed Protestants with distrust and prejudice, so when the rumor surfaced, it was taken as fact. Jean Calas, in the eyes of the authorities and many in the community, became a religious fanatic who would rather kill his own son than allow him to convert.
The idea that a Protestant father could murder his child for considering conversion to Catholicism was rooted in the long history of religious conflict in France. Remember, this was a country that had seen brutal wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries. By the time Jean Calas was on trial, the tensions between Catholics and Protestants were still simmering, even though open conflict had largely subsided. So, the case became a symbol of those old religious divisions.
Once the authorities decided they had their story, the so-called investigation that followed was a farce. Witnesses were called to testify, but many of them were Catholic neighbors who already had a bias against the Calas family. These testimonies were riddled with inconsistencies, yet they were accepted without question. One of the more disturbing aspects of the trial was the way public opinion and religious paranoia shaped the entire process.
Absolutely. From the start, Jean Calas didn't stand a chance. The local magistrates were influenced by the Catholic Church, which was pushing the narrative that this was a case of a Protestant father trying to stop his son from betraying the faith. They were looking for a way to send a message, not to find the truth.
In fact, the authorities subjected the entire Calas family to intense questioning, trying to uncover any indication of a religiously motivated crime. Jean, his wife Anne-Rose, and their surviving children were grilled over and over, but none of their testimonies wavered. They all insisted that Marc-Antoine had been deeply troubled and likely took his own life. But the truth didn't matter.
And it gets worse. After the initial arrest, Jean Calas was held in solitary confinement for months while investigators worked to build a case against him. The legal proceedings were anything but fair. Jean didn't have access to a proper defense attorney, and any evidence that might have exonerated him was ignored. The trial wasn't just about determining guilt or innocence. It was about appeasing a Catholic public eager to see a Protestant punished.
It's also worth noting how the legal system in France at the time was structured. Judges in 18th century France had an enormous amount of power, and they weren't bound by modern standards of evidence. If the judge believed the defendant was guilty, that belief could shape the outcome of the entire case. The legal system was less concerned with the truth and more focused on maintaining order, and, in this case, religious order.
Yeah, that's a great point. The trial wasn't held in some neutral environment. The judges and officials overseeing the case were heavily influenced by Catholicism and the desire to reinforce Catholic dominance in the region. And that desire to maintain religious control was more important to them than actual evidence.
As the trial progressed, the idea that Jean Calas had murdered his son because of religion became accepted as fact, even though the family continued to insist that Marc-Antoine had been suicidal. No evidence was ever presented that Marc-Antoine was planning to convert, but the accusation itself was enough. The combination of religious bias, flawed legal practices, and public hysteria meant that the verdict was almost a foregone conclusion.
The prosecution played to the crowd, essentially painting Jean as a fanatical Protestant willing to go to extreme lengths to keep his family from betraying their faith. Even when Jean testified in his own defense, his words fell on deaf ears. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial, stating over and over that he loved his son and would never harm him, let alone kill him. But by then, the court was more interested in a conviction than the truth.
And this brings us to one of the more tragic elements of the trial: there was never any real effort to find the truth. Marc-Antoine's struggles, his potential mental health issues, and the evidence pointing to suicide were all dismissed. The judges and the public had already made up their minds. Jean Calas was found guilty of murdering his son in March 1762, and the punishment was as brutal as the conviction was unjust.
Jean was sentenced to death by torture, a punishment that was almost medieval in its cruelty. But before we get into the horrific details of that, it's important to remember just how deeply the trial was influenced by religious paranoia. This wasn't just about one man accused of murder, it was a trial shaped by centuries of Catholic-Protestant conflict, and Jean Calas became a scapegoat for the tensions that were still simmering under the surface.
Exactly. In the eyes of the court and the public, Jean wasn't just a man on trial, he was a symbol of everything they distrusted about Protestants. His trial and conviction were more about reinforcing Catholic dominance than about justice. The real tragedy here is that the entire process was driven by fear and bigotry, not by any sincere effort to find the truth.
And in the end, that fear and bigotry led to one of the most infamous miscarriages of justice in French history. But before we get to the final, brutal chapter of Jean Calas' life, let's take a moment to reflect on how dangerous unchecked religious paranoia can be.
Yeah, it's a reminder that when societies let prejudice guide their decisions, real people pay the price. Jean Calas wasn't just a victim of the legal system, he was a victim of a society that saw him and his family as the other, and that's something that can still resonate today.
All right, listeners, buckle up. This is where the story of Jean Calas takes a horrific turn. After being found guilty of murdering his son, despite a complete lack of evidence, Jean was sentenced to death by one of the most brutal methods of execution used in France at the time, execution by breaking on the wheel. But before we get into that, let's talk about the torture Jean endured leading up to his death.
Right. So, Jean Calas was sentenced not just to die, but to be tortured into confessing first. This was part of a legal process known as the question, a method used in certain capital cases where authorities believed the convicted might be hiding some final truth. In other words, they wanted to force a confession out of him, because even after the trial, there were doubts among the officials that they'd gotten a full admission from him.
It's almost surreal, right? Jean Calas had maintained his innocence throughout the trial, and there was no hard evidence to suggest he was guilty of any crime. But still, the court ordered torture to try to force him to confess to something he didn't do. At this point, they weren't seeking justice, they were seeking closure for a narrative they had already written.
The method of torture used on Jean was called la question extraordinaire, or the extraordinary question. This wasn't some ordinary interrogation technique, it was designed to inflict as much pain as possible in the hope that the prisoner would break. For Jean, this began with the water torture, known as the torture de l'eau.
Yeah, the torture de l'eau was especially horrific. Jean was forced to drink extraordinary amounts of water, gallons and gallons of it, while he was bound and immobilized. Picture this, Jean's mouth was pried open, and a funnel was inserted. Water was then poured down his throat, filling his stomach to the point where it felt like it would burst. His lungs were crushed, his body stretched, and his breath labored under the intense pressure. Essentially, it simulated drowning and suffocation, all while Jean's body swelled from the sheer volume of water being forced into him.
That's right. The agony was unimaginable. His internal organs would have been pressed to their limit, and he would have felt like he was suffocating from within. And remember, this was happening to a man who was in his 60s at the time, not some young, resilient individual. Jean was already vulnerable, yet the torturers pushed him to the edge.
And even after enduring that, Jean Calas didn't break. Despite the excruciating pain, he continued to maintain his innocence. He never admitted to killing his son, because, as far as we know, he simply didn't do it.
Exactly. The authorities weren't done with him though. After the water torture, they moved on to the torture de cordes, or the strapado. This involved tying ropes around Jean's limbs and slowly pulling them tight. The ropes were twisted tighter and tighter, stretching his arms and legs in ways they were never meant to move. This technique often resulted in dislocated shoulders, broken bones, and torn muscles.
The goal was to dislocate his joints, to make the pain so unbearable that he would confess. But Jean held firm. Even as his body was being broken, he refused to admit to the crime. He knew that confessing wouldn't save his life, he was already sentenced to die, but he remained steadfast in his innocence, hoping that maybe, just maybe, someone would realize the truth.
Jean's resilience during this torture is remarkable. Despite everything, he never wavered in his claim that he was innocent, that his son had likely taken his own life, and that he had nothing to do with it. This wasn't just physical strength, it was mental and moral fortitude. He knew the confession they wanted wasn't the truth, and he refused to give it to them, even though it might have shortened his suffering.
After enduring hours of this brutal treatment, Jean was left broken, physically, at least. But the torture didn't yield the result the authorities wanted. They failed to extract the confession, so they moved forward with the execution. And this is where things get even more grim.
Right. The punishment for Jean's supposed crime was to be broken on the wheel. For those unfamiliar, this was one of the most gruesome forms of execution in early modern Europe. The condemned person would be tied to a large wooden cartwheel. Their arms, legs, and body would be positioned over the spokes, and a heavy iron bar or hammer would be used to shatter their bones, one by one.
The goal wasn't just to kill the person quickly. It was to prolong their agony, to make them suffer for as long as possible before they finally succumbed to their injuries. Jean would have been fully conscious as each of his limbs was broken, first his arms, then his legs, and then his chest. It was designed to destroy the body while keeping the victim alive for as long as possible.
The executioner would strike with deliberate force, but not enough to immediately kill. The idea was to cause maximum pain, to crush bones and joints, leaving the condemned writhing in agony. Jean would have been strapped down, unable to move, as each blow shattered more of his body. It's said that during the execution, Jean continued to profess his innocence, still refusing to confess, even as his body was destroyed.
That's something that stands out in all the historical accounts, Jean's refusal to admit guilt, even as he was being tortured to death. His last words were declarations of innocence, spoken through unimaginable pain. He never broke, not even at the very end.
And even after all that, his suffering wasn't over. After the executioner had broken Jean's body, he was left on the wheel to die. Sometimes, this could take hours, or even days, depending on the condition of the person and the extent of the injuries. Jean Calas mercifully didn't last long. His broken body gave out within a few hours, and he died on March 10, 1762.
His body was then burned, as was customary for someone convicted of such a crime, and his ashes were scattered. The whole process was designed not just to kill Jean, but to erase him, to erase his memory, his family's honor, and any trace of his existence. The authorities wanted to send a message: this is what happens when Protestants challenge the order.
And yet, despite all the cruelty, Jean's name would not be forgotten. Far from it. His death, though horrifying, would become the catalyst for one of the most important legal and moral battles in 18th century France. People like Voltaire would take up his cause, using his case to expose the dangers of religious intolerance and judicial corruption.
But at that moment, on the wheel, Jean Calas was just a man facing an unjust death. His family was shattered, his life ruined, and the truth buried under layers of prejudice and fear. It's a heartbreaking end to a story that never should have gone this far.
Exactly. Jean Calas' torture and execution are reminders of the very real human cost of injustice. His death was the result of a broken system, one that valued religious conformity and fear over truth and fairness. And unfortunately, it was his death that would be necessary to spark the changes that followed.
It's one of those moments in history that makes you stop and ask how things could have gone so wrong. So, we've just talked about Jean Calas' tragic and unjust death. But the story doesn't end there, because this isn't just a tale of a wrongful execution, it's also a story about how one of the most influential thinkers of the time, Voltaire, helped turn a grave injustice into a symbol for reform. Let's dive into how Voltaire got involved and how his actions shaped the aftermath of this tragedy.
That's right. After Jean Calas was executed in 1762, his family was devastated, not only by the loss of their patriarch but by the stigma attached to his name. The family's reputation was shattered. They had been accused of murder, religion had been blamed, and society had basically written them off. But Anne-Rose Calas, Jean's widow, wasn't ready to give up. She believed in her husband's innocence and wasn't going to let his name be dragged through the mud without a fight.
And here's where Voltaire comes in. At the time, Voltaire was already a prominent figure, one of the leading voices of the Enlightenment, a philosopher and writer known for his criticism of the Church and the French legal system. Voltaire had a reputation for standing up against injustice and hypocrisy, especially where religion and power intersected. So, when he heard about the case of Jean Calas, it immediately struck a chord with him.
Voltaire's involvement began a few months after Jean's execution. Anne-Rose Calas and her surviving children traveled to Geneva, seeking help and support from Protestants there. Through mutual connections, the story eventually reached Voltaire, who was living in Ferney, just outside Geneva. Voltaire was outraged when he learned the details. To him, this was not just a personal tragedy, but a glaring example of the dangers of religious intolerance and judicial corruption, two issues he had been railing against for years.
Yeah, and Voltaire saw an opportunity here. He realized that the Calas case was the perfect example of the kind of injustice he had been writing about in his works. This wasn't just about Jean Calas, it was about the bigger picture. France, under the heavy influence of the Catholic Church, was still mired in superstition, intolerance, and a legal system that prioritized the interests of the powerful over truth and fairness.
Exactly. Voltaire took it upon himself to launch a full-blown campaign to clear Jean Calas' name and expose the injustices that led to his death. He was relentless. First, he wrote extensively about the case in letters, essays, and pamphlets, reaching out to influential figures across Europe. He made sure the case wasn't forgotten by the public, framing it as an example of religious persecution that should horrify any reasonable person.
And Voltaire wasn't just relying on emotion, he meticulously gathered evidence to build his case. He interviewed the Calas family and other witnesses, reviewed trial documents, and collected statements from anyone who might be able to shed light on the truth. Voltaire wasn't a lawyer, but he knew how to present a compelling argument. He systematically tore apart the prosecution's case, pointing out the inconsistencies, the lack of evidence, and the clear bias in the way the trial had been conducted.
One of the key things Voltaire focused on was the idea that Marc-Antoine had been suicidal, something that was never seriously considered by the court. Voltaire highlighted how the authorities had twisted the facts to fit their preferred narrative, that a Protestant father had murdered his son to prevent his conversion to Catholicism. Voltaire argued, and rightly so, that the court had ignored the most likely explanation for Marc-Antoine's death in favor of a story that played into their religious prejudices.
Voltaire also used the Calas case to point out the absurdity and cruelty of torture as a tool for extracting confessions. He argued that the use of torture not only led to false confessions but was a violation of basic human dignity. This was a key part of his broader critique of the French legal system, which, in his view, was stuck in the Dark Ages, relying on superstition and barbaric practices rather than reason and justice.
And while Voltaire's campaign was gaining steam, he didn't just focus on writing. He used his vast network of contacts across Europe to get powerful people involved. He lobbied government officials, influential intellectuals, and even foreign royalty to take an interest in the case. His goal was to make the Calas case a cause célèbre, a symbol of the broader fight against injustice, religious intolerance, and legal corruption.
His efforts paid off. In 1763, thanks in large part to Voltaire's relentless advocacy, the case was reopened. This was a significant victory in itself because, in 18th-century France, reopening a case like this, especially after an execution, was almost unheard of. It showed just how much pressure Voltaire had been able to apply. A new investigation was ordered, and this time, the process was more thorough and less tainted by religious bias.
The investigation took 2 years, but in 1765, Jean Calas was posthumously exonerated by the French court. The verdict was clear: there was no evidence that Jean had killed his son, and it was far more likely that Marc-Antoine had died by suicide. This ruling cleared Jean Calas' name, and the family was compensated for the injustice they had suffered. It was a huge victory, not just for the Calas family, but for Voltaire and everyone who had fought to expose the truth.
It's incredible when you think about it. Voltaire had taken a case that was almost forgotten, and through sheer force of will, he had turned it into a national and international issue. His efforts didn't just result in justice for the Calas family, they helped shift public opinion and laid the groundwork for future reforms. The Calas affair became a symbol of the need for legal and judicial reform in France, and it played a role in shaping the growing Enlightenment movement, which called for reason, fairness, and tolerance.
Voltaire's work on the Calas case is often seen as one of the first examples of a public intellectual using media and public opinion to challenge a legal injustice. It's something we see more commonly today, public figures using their platform to shine a light on injustices, but in Voltaire's time, this was revolutionary. He showed that the pen could indeed be mightier than the sword, and that public opinion, when properly mobilized, could effect real change.
And it wasn't just about changing the legal system, it was about changing the way people thought. Voltaire used the Calas case to argue for religious tolerance, a cornerstone of his Enlightenment philosophy. He made it clear that the kind of religious intolerance that had led to Jean Calas' death was not just a failure of the courts, but a failure of society. He called for a world where people of different faiths could live together without fear of persecution, a world where justice was based on reason and evidence, not superstition and bias.
That's a huge part of Voltaire's legacy. The Calas case wasn't just a victory for one family, it was a turning point in the broader fight for human rights. It inspired future reformers to challenge the status quo and demand a fairer, more just society. The case also highlighted the growing tension between the old order, which was based on religious authority and rigid social hierarchies, and the new Enlightenment ideals of reason, individual rights, and equality before the law.
And let's not forget the personal cost to Voltaire. He risked a lot by taking on this case. Publicly challenging the church and the French legal system was no small thing in the 18th century. He faced backlash from powerful figures, but he never backed down. His efforts weren't just about intellectual debate, they were about real, tangible change.
Ultimately, the Calas case remains one of the most important episodes in Voltaire's life and work. It showed the power of persistence in the face of injustice and the importance of using one's voice to stand up for those who can't defend themselves. Voltaire's role in the case transformed Jean Calas from a victim of injustice into a symbol of the fight for religious tolerance and judicial reform.
And that's why Jean Calas' story, as tragic as it is, has an important legacy. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, there are those who will stand up and fight for what's right. And sometimes, they succeed.
Absolutely. And it's thanks to people like Voltaire that we can look back on cases like this and learn from them. The Calas case not only led to a reassessment of the French legal system but also helped push forward the Enlightenment ideals that would eventually inspire the French Revolution and the development of modern human rights.
A truly powerful story. So listeners, next time you think about the struggle for justice and human rights, remember Jean Calas and Voltaire, two names forever linked by tragedy and triumph. And that, folks, is the story of Jean Calas, a tale of injustice, cruelty, and ultimately, a fight for truth and justice. It's one of those stories that reminds us how far we've come, but also how important it is to remain vigilant when it comes to protecting individual rights and standing against prejudice.
Absolutely. The case of Jean Calas is a powerful reminder of how dangerous it can be when fear, religious intolerance, and mob mentality take the place of evidence and reason. It's also a testament to the fact that even in the face of overwhelming injustice, people like Voltaire can make a difference.
Speaking of making a difference, we want to thank all of you for tuning in and listening to us week after week. Your support keeps this show going, and we truly appreciate it. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to rate and review the History AI podcast wherever you get your podcasts.
Especially those 5-star reviews. They really help the podcast grow and reach new history lovers out there. And don't forget, you can always suggest new topics for us to cover. We're active on social media, so drop us a message with your suggestions or just let us know what you think about the show. We love hearing from you.
Also, a quick shout out to our listeners who've been asking about merch. It's finally here. We've got t-shirts, mugs, and more with the History AI podcast logo. You can find the link in the show notes or head to our website to check it out. Support the show and show off your history pride at the same time.
And remember, all of our episodes are evergreen, which means they're timeless. So whether you're new to the podcast or a long-time listener, you can dive into our back catalog at any time and still get relevant, engaging content.
That's right. Every episode we create is made to last, just like the lessons from history. So share your favorite episodes with friends, family, or anyone you know who loves a good story from the past.
Thanks again for joining us today. We've got more incredible stories coming your way, so stay tuned, and we'll see you next time on the History AI podcast.
Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.